When it comes to supplements, only a select few make my must-have list. And at the very top of that list is creatine. But here's the thing. Creatine isn't just for bodybuilders or gym enthusiasts. It's really a game changer for almost everyone. In this episode, I'm breaking down 5 compelling evidence-based reasons why creatine deserves a spot in your daily supplement routine. Whether you've heard about creatine before or perhaps this is your first introduction, stick around because I'll be covering several new studies, including one hot off the press that explores how creatine might boost your cognition after a poor night's sleep. But first, my team tells me that more than 55% of all watch time on the Proof YouTube channel is from people who are not subscribed. So if you haven't yet, please hit subscribe so we can keep you up to date with new episodes. And you'll also be doing us a huge favor by helping the show reach more people. Let's start with some basics. What exactly is creatine? Creatine is a non-protein amino acid that the body produces, mostly in the liver, but also the pancreas and the kidneys, which plays an important role in cellular metabolism and energy production within important organs that have high energy demands, such as muscle, brain, heart, and bone tissues. Essentially, having creatine around helps cells in these tissues produce more ATP. Our cells need this ATP on hand to function optimally. About 95% of the body's creatine is found in muscle cells, and most of the remainder is found in brain, bone, and heart cells. So keeping it very, very simple, creatine is an amino acid that allows your cells to function as they should. A non-protein amino acid means that unlike amino acids like leucine and valine, which you may have heard of, creatine is not used to synthesize proteins, but rather has direct effects on physiology as an amino acid itself. The key takeaway here being that creatine is important for energy production and metabolism, and the body is able to manufacture it. In fact, the liver, pancreas, and kidneys produce about 1 gram of creatine per day from the amino acids arginine, glycine, and methionine. And the average person eating an omnivorous Western diet gets another 1 gram or so per day through animal foods such as red meat and fish, which are relatively rich in creatine. In fact, quick bit of history for you while we're here. Creatine was discovered in meat in 1832 by a French scientist, Michel Eugene Chevreul. He named it creatine from the Greek word creus, which means meat. Because we can make creatine, it's considered non-essential, but as we will come to later, that doesn't mean that an additional intake, even above what's typically achieved with food, isn't preferred or more beneficial, so to speak. In the rare case where someone has a genetic mutation that impairs their ability to make or transport creatine, so-called creatine deficiency disorders or CDDs, patients typically present with delays in cognitive and physical development, speech and language disorders, cognitive dysfunction, behavioral disorders, seizures, and/or muscle weakness. Now that you know what creatine is, let's get into the 5 reasons why I believe just about everyone should supplement with it. And then we can finish with my supplementation recommendations, dose, type of creatine, etc. Reason number 1 to supplement with creatine. Creatine improves strength, muscle mass, and body composition. Several large meta-analyses of clinical trials have concluded that supplementing with creatine monohydrate improves strength, muscle mass, and body composition. The main mechanism that explains these benefits is increased time to exhaustion. Put simply, creatine allows you to do more work at a high intensity before you fatigue, and more work equals greater training adaptations. This is a finding that's been reproduced over decades in men and women during adulthood and late adulthood. Importantly, these clinical trials suggest that these improvements in strength, muscle mass, and body composition are mostly observed when someone supplements creatine in conjunction with resistance training. And while these body composition results have been observed in both men and women, men do seem to respond a little more favorably to creatine supplementation. It's not fully understood why men seem to respond better to creatine supplementation when it comes to this outcome of body composition, but it is thought that it may be to do with baseline creatine levels, with some evidence, and I quote here, that females may have higher intramuscular creatine stores, which may blunt their responsiveness to creatine supplementation. The idea being that because men's baseline creatine levels are relatively lower, they may benefit more from an exogenous source of creatine. Broadly speaking, men see about a 1 to 1.5 kilogram increase in fat-free mass, and women about a half a kilogram increase in fat-free mass. And on average, there's a little less than a 1% reduction in body fat percentage. The key takeaway here is that creatine can improve body composition, but it's not magic. Similar to protein, unless the stimulus is there, i.e. resistance training, while you may see some modest improvements in strength, physical performance, function, and body composition, they will be much more limited than if you combine creatine with resistance training. So in that sense, you can kind of consider creatine as an amplifier. It's going to amplify the results that you get from your resistance training. To give you an idea of how consistent this result is, the International Society of Sports Nutrition said this in a 2018 review, and I quote, "Creatine monohydrate is the most effective ergogenic, which means performance enhancing, nutritional supplement currently available to athletes in terms of increasing high intensity exercise capacity and lean body mass during training," end quote. Would I supplement with creatine if I couldn't do resistance training? The data here is quite mixed, but yes, I probably still would. But I also would be realistic about the results that I expect. They're going to be much less than if I was combining creatine with resistance training. The dose used in the majority of these studies is 3 to 5 grams per day or 0.1 grams per kilogram of body mass. The latter being a little more individualized because it considers your muscle mass. So for someone who's 80 kilograms, that would be 8 grams per day. For someone who's 50 kilograms, that would be 5 grams per day. You may have heard of creatine loading phases. Some studies have used this to quickly get creatine levels in muscle tissue to a point of saturation, i.e. the maximum amount of creatine within muscle cells. This protocol typically involves dosing with 20 to 25 grams of creatine per day for 5 to 7 days when first starting, and then shifting to that maintenance dose I just mentioned of 3 to 5 grams per day or 0.1 grams per kilogram. While you can do that to get your creatine levels up sooner, we now understand that it's not really that necessary. If you just begin with 3 to 5 grams per day or 0.1 grams per kilogram, you will get to the same point of creatine saturation within muscle cells within about 28 days. Importantly, and we'll revisit this, if for some reason you really quickly want to increase creatine stores, and so you do choose to do this loading phase, it's a good idea to split this 20 to 25 gram dose up throughout the day into 2 or 3 serves if you're someone that gets gastrointestinal distress following creatine consumption, nausea, diarrhea, etc., which isn't that uncommon. While we're talking about an increase in lean body mass, you may have heard that creatine increases water retention. Is it possible that the increase in fat-free mass is from water? Is it actually muscle tissue? While there is some data that suggests creatine does indeed increase water retention in the first few weeks or so when you begin supplementing, which is why someone may see their scale weight go up in those early weeks, this water is mostly confined to within muscle cells. Now, this is a good thing because not only does it make you look more, dare I say, toned or firm, but the extra water in muscle cells improves cell signaling, resulting in more protein synthesis and more muscle tissue over time. Simply put, more water in muscle cells, more protein synthesis, more muscle. And this certainly isn't just about aesthetics. If you're a regular listener and or you've done our zero cost living proof challenge, you will know being strong and having good body composition is crucial for maintaining optimal metabolic health and functional independence as we age. The other perk with supplementing creatine alongside resistance training is that there is some recent evidence suggesting it will improve your sleep on the days you do resistance training. A fascinating new study, hot off the press, randomized premenopausal women to 5 grams of creatine per day for 6 weeks or placebo with resistance training performed twice a week. Subjects were wearing a fitness tracker to track their sleep. Sleep duration was significantly longer, about 50 minutes or more per night, on resistance training days in the subjects supplementing with creatine. Reason number 2 to supplement with creatine: improved recovery and performance for endurance athletes. This might be one of the less discussed benefits of adding creatine to your supplement stack. Creatine appears to not only be beneficial for people who are doing resistance training, where you have high intensity efforts for 20 or 30 seconds or so, depending on the number of reps being performed in your set, but also people who do certain types of prolonged endurance exercise. This is thought to be explained by a few mechanisms, the main one being enhanced glycogen stores. Glycogen is how we store glucose. Consider it carbohydrate that resides in your muscle cells that's used up during intense and prolonged exercise. Studies have shown that when you add creatine to dietary carbohydrates, glycogen stores are restored more quickly and you store more glycogen compared to ingesting carbohydrates without creatine. More glycogen means more available carbohydrate to be used to generate energy at high intensities. And then there's also evidence that suggests having greater glycogen stores can help prevent overtraining during intense training periods. The age-old debate about creatine for endurance athletes, however, is whether or not this improvement in glycogen replenishment and storage outweighs the extra lean body mass that comes with creatine supplementation. If you're going to run a marathon, do you really want to be half a kilogram or 1 kilogram heavier? How an endurance athlete makes this decision will largely rest on the type of endurance activity that they are engaging in, and of course some self-experimentation. If the exercise or sport requires low-intensity, sustained activity without surges of high-intensity work, studies suggest that creatine is probably not going to be a net positive. That extra weight will just slow the athlete down. However, if the endurance activity, and by endurance here, I mean activity over 3 minutes long, requires surges of high intensity work, like triathlon, cross-country skiing, rowing, etc., studies suggest physical performance could in fact be improved with creatine supplementation. The benefit here being that you have more glycogen on board, which means more available glucose for rapid ATP synthesis. And with high creatine stores, you can recycle more ATP and thus be a little more resistant to fatigue during those high intensity surges. There's also some evidence suggesting that creatine can improve recovery and muscle pain after prolonged exercise, with a study that I found in the early 2000s showing reduced cell damage and inflammation after a 30-kilometer run with 5 grams of creatine per day for the 4 days leading up to the event. Overall, it is certainly true that there is less evidence to support creatine for endurance exercise. However, as I said, if your endurance activity involves surges or sprints, high intensity work where you are absolutely blowing up, then you might want to experiment with creatine. Track your performance and see if you have improved, stayed the same, or gone backwards. If you choose to go with the 3 to 5 grams per day or 0.1 grams per kilogram protocol, I would allow at least a month to monitor your results so you can see how your performance is when your muscle cells are fully saturated with creatine. Or do the loading phase of 20 to 25 grams per day for 7 days before shifting to that maintenance phase. Reason number 3 to supplement with creatine. Creatine may help improve osteoarthritis. This one's close to heart. As many of you know, I started my career as a physiotherapist. There was an interesting clinical trial published in 2011 in the Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise by Neves et al. And in this study, they took 26 postmenopausal women with knee osteoarthritis, and they randomized them to creatine and lower limb resistance training, or placebo and lower limb resistance training. This was a 12-week double-blind randomized controlled trial, so neither the subjects or the coaches helping with the resistance training and performing the measurements of function were aware who was given creatine and who was given the placebo until after the study. A nice study design. The subjects in the creatine arm received 20 grams of creatine monohydrate per day for the first week, followed by 5 grams of creatine per day for the next 11 weeks. The placebo group was given the exact same doses, only they were given dextrose, not creatine. All participants reported 100% compliance with the supplementation protocol. Both groups did lower limb resistance training 3 times per week over the 12 weeks under the supervision of a fitness professional. By the end of the trial, only the subjects supplementing with creatine had a significant improvement in physical function, stiffness, lower limb lean mass, and quality of life. Both groups did have a significant reduction in pain, indicating that resistance training alone is a great idea for postmenopausal women with knee osteoarthritis to reduce pain, which is consistent with many other studies. studies. But better again is combining it with creatine monohydrate for physical function and quality of life improvements. It's worth noting that the researchers did mention in their discussion that none of the 26 subjects in this particular study had severe osteoarthritis, so we really cannot generalize these results to subjects who are candidates for joint replacement surgery. More research would be needed there. That said, I did include this as one of the 5 reasons to supplement with creatine because almost 10% of adults in countries like USA and Australia do suffer from osteoarthritis, many of who are not candidates for joint replacement surgery or don't want to have surgery. So there is a lot of people, maybe you listening or someone you know, whose quality of life could significantly improve by supplementing creatine in conjunction with resistance training. Reason number 4 to supplement with creatine. Creatine may help your brain recover after periods of stress. This is another new study hot off the press. I've brought you a couple of those today. You're welcome. A really, really cool study. It's well described in the scientific literature that cognitive performance is impaired after sleep deprivation. In fact, I bet you've experienced that yourself. The old brain being a little sluggish after being kept up all night. This was a double-blind, randomized crossover trial. There was 15 subjects, 8 were female, 7 male, average age of 23 years, and they were brought into an inpatient setting and completed brain scans and cognitive tests at 6 p.m. to get a baseline before being kept awake all night. After the baseline testing at 6 p.m., they were given either 0.35 grams per kilogram of creatine monohydrate or 0.35 grams per kilogram of placebo before being kept awake all night and undergoing brain scans and completing cognitive tests at 2-hour intervals from 11:30 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. This is quite a high dose of creatine. For someone who weighs 70 kilograms, it's 25 grams. The rationale being that neurons, a type of cell in our brains, appear to have increased energy requirements after sleep deprivation. And in order to get enough creatine into the brain, you have to administer a very high dose that first saturates muscle cells with enough left over to then cross the blood-brain barrier. Here's what they found. Firstly, the oral creatine monohydrate was bioavailable to the brain, meaning that this single dose significantly raised brain creatine levels. Secondly, when given creatine, subjects had significantly less subjective fatigue. They didn't feel as tired. Third, creatine supplementation significantly improved short-term memory and reaction speed. The maximum cognitive effect was observed at 4 hours post-creatine ingestion, but lasted up to 9 hours post-ingestion. Surprising to me here was that the creatine was well tolerated in subjects with no reports of gastrointestinal symptoms despite the very high dose. So overall, a compelling study that supports high-dose creatine supplementation after getting insufficient sleep if you're wanting to feel less fatigued and feel more mentally switched on. While we're talking about creatine and cognition, a lot has been made in recent years about high-dose creatine supplementation for cognition more broadly, with many on social media now recommending 10 to 30 grams of creatine per day, even for healthy individuals. My view here is perhaps slightly different to what you've come across online. I'm not yet fully convinced that outside of days where you are affected by something like sleep deprivation, there's enough evidence to support high-dose creatine supplementation for cognition, especially in healthy adults. A theoretical case can be made that in people who have insufficient brain levels of creatine during periods of high mental stress, for example, or chronic brain conditions such as Alzheimer's and depression, that high-dose creatine may be beneficial, especially in older adults, but this is far from proven at a clinical level as we sit here today. What about vegetarians and vegans? You might come across this idea online that when it comes to cognition, vegetarians will benefit more from creatine supplementation than omnivores because of their lower dietary creatine intakes, even if they are otherwise healthy. There's actually no good evidence to support that. There's a single study by Benton et al. That people often point to as evidence that vegetarians benefit more from creatine than omnivores when it comes to cognitive performance. But what people are not appreciating is that the result in this study was driven by a decline in performance between tests in the omnivore group, not improved performance in the vegetarian group. There's a bit of physiology here that is important to understand. While it was once hypothesized hypothesized that vegetarians may have lower brain creatine levels. That's actually been studied, and it's now understood that vegetarians do not have lower brain creatine levels than omnivores, at least in healthy subjects. When your brain is functioning properly, your brain creatine level seems to almost entirely be determined by creatine synthesis that occurs in astrocytes, cells that reside in the brain, not from creatine in your diet. This is different to muscle tissue. Muscle tissue creatine levels are much more affected by our diet, and it is true that vegetarians and vegans tend to have lower muscle creatine levels than omnivores. This is why vegetarians tend to benefit more from creatine supplementation when it comes to performance than omnivores. But that said, omnivores still don't get enough creatine in their diet to fully saturate their muscle cells, which is why even folks like my friend Paul Saladino, who eats a very meat-heavy diet, supplements with creatine. Isn't that right, Paul?
Here's a day of eating for me, POV edition. First thing in the morning, pre-surf, I'll have some raw goat milk, add some creatine to that, and a little bit of raw, organic, glyphosate-free honey, and then I'm off to the ocean to chase some waves.
Thank you, Paul, for that cameo. Coming back to the brain and cognition here, as soon as you have some sort of brain injury, be it from acute insults from concussion or chronic from depression, Alzheimer's, etc., it is certainly plausible that dietary creatine or creatine supplementation becomes more important in this context. As we've just seen with the recent study on sleep deprivation, this is an area of active research, so I suspect over the coming years this is something that we will all better understand. Perhaps there will be a creatine protocol for those with depression, Alzheimer's, post-concussion, etc. Or not. We'll see what the data shows. Either way, make sure that you are subscribed to the show here, and I'll be sure to keep you updated. In the meantime, given that creatine monohydrate has a good safety profile at doses up to 30 grams per day for a wide range of people, except those with pre-existing kidney disease, and is relatively inexpensive, it might be something you're comfortable experimenting with until we have more data, especially if you're an older adult, or you're someone who has a history of acute brain injury like concussion and or chronic brain conditions like Alzheimer's or depression. Reason number 5 to supplement with creatine. Creatine may improve your bone health. For years, scientists have speculated that creatine may be beneficial for increasing bone mineral density and reducing risk of fractures. There are 2 main mechanisms that brought about this hypothesis. First, creatine has been shown in preclinical studies to increase the activity of osteoblasts, cells that produce bone tissue. Second, we know that creatine increases strength and muscle mass, which means more force is transferred from muscle and tendon to bone. That increased force could then stimulate the bone to grow stronger. Dr. Darren Kandau, a previous guest of The Proof, and colleagues set out to investigate this. Their recent study found that postmenopausal women randomized to 2 years of creatine supplementation at a dose of 0.14 grams per day alongside resistance training 3 days per week did not improve bone mineral density, but did improve bone geometry at the femoral head compared to placebo. We don't know if this improvement in bone geometry means less risk of falls and fractures because the study wasn't long enough to track that, but it's suggestive that this will be the case. The authors of this study concluded, and I quote, "Collectively, creatine with strength training may enhance bone strength via altered bone geometry, but has no effect on bone mineral. Future research examining the potential of creatine to reduce the impact on falls is warranted." End quote. For the meantime, if you are a postmenopausal woman, particularly if you have low bone mineral density, a history of falls, or a family history of osteopenia, osteoporosis, you may want to consider supplementing with 0.14 grams of creatine monohydrate per kilogram per day alongside a good resistance training program. For a 70 kilogram woman, that's around 10 grams per day. If you're interested to hear more on creatine and bone health, check out my episode with Dr. Darren Kandau. Okay, now that we've discussed 5 reasons to supplement with creatine, let's talk about what type of creatine is best, what dose is most optimal, and what the safety profile of creatine is like. There are a bunch of different types of creatine that you'll find online and in your local supplement stores. Creatine monohydrate is the most common, but you may also see creatine ethyl ester or CEE, creatine hydrochloride or HCl, creatine magnesium chelate, and buffered creatine, also called Cre-alkaline. So what is the most effective form of creatine? Well, there's no science to my knowledge that suggests any of these less common forms of creatine are more effective than creatine monohydrate at inducing the health benefits we've gone through in this episode. In fact, creatine monohydrate is the form of creatine that is far and away the most studied and science-supported form of creatine. Here's a conclusion from a recent review of clinical trials investigating creatine, and I quote, "Based on the current meta-analysis, creatine monohydrate is well studied, effective, has a well-developed safety profile, and is economical. Additionally, confirmed by a previous review, creatine monohydrate is the only source of creatine that has substantial evidence to support bioavailability, efficacy, and safety recommended by professional societies and organizations. Future research may be warranted to explore alternative forms of creatine. However, presently it is clear that other forms of creatine are not superior to creatine monohydrate." End quote. My assumption is that these other forms of creatine have popped up and often claim to be superior without strong evidence because creatine monohydrate is a very cheap supplement to make, and there are literally thousands of brands globally selling it, which makes it relatively inexpensive to the consumer. Choosing to go with a more novel form of creatine with a fancy story about absorption, for example, is how brands create a unique selling proposition, which then allows them to make sales in a competitive market and increase their margin by selling at a higher retail price, all based on the unsubstantiated claim that their form of creatine is somehow superior to creatine monohydrate. The take-home point is to save your money and stick with the trusty creatine monohydrate. The true evidence-based brands use this form of creatine. When selecting a creatine monohydrate, there are a few things to consider. The first is the supplier of the creatine, not the supplement brand, but who they source from. My preference for a supplier of creatine monohydrate is Creapure, which is the most well-studied high-quality creatine monohydrate produced by a German supplier. It is the creatine monohydrate that is used in the majority of peer-reviewed creatine studies. So first things first, I'm looking for Creapure on the label. But I also go a step further these days and look for an NSF certified creatine. There's been some recent controversy where brands selling creatine, especially creatine gummies, claim to have X grams of creatine per dose, but allegedly have skimped on their formulation and instead use other ingredients that are cheaper again than creatine to improve their margins. For this reason, I personally supplement with Momentous creatine monohydrate. They use the Creapure creatine monohydrate from Germany, and their product is also NSF certified for sport, which means it's third-party tested for purity, contaminants, etc. This is the third-party testing that is recommended by the NFL, NBA, PGA, Ironman, etc., and many other organizations that are seeking to mitigate the risks of contaminated dietary supplements. If it's good enough for professional athletes, it's good enough for me. So that's the type of creatine and my recommended brand, Momentous. But what about dose? Well, this really comes down to the benefit that you are personally chasing. The strongest evidence is for 3 to 5 grams per day or 0.1 grams per kilogram per day for building strength, muscle, and improving body composition. If, as we discussed earlier, you're wanting to experiment with high-dose creatine supplementation for cognition, it is important to remember that the first 5 or so grams of creatine that you consume per day is taken up by muscle. So you need to fill that tissue up first before creatine starts to go to other tissues like brain and bone. That's why the typical dose in studies looking at increasing brain creatine levels are 10 to 30 grams of creatine per day. And then there's the dose for improving cognition on specific days after sleep deprivation, which was 0.35 grams per kilogram. For someone like me that weighs around 90 kilograms, that's roughly 30 grams of creatine, quite a high dose. Personally, my regular dose of creatine is 10 grams per day, split over 2 5-gram servings with food. I find that I tolerate that best. Why 10 grams? Well, I weigh 90 kilograms, and so using the 0.1 grams per kilogram calculation, I get to 9 grams, and then I round that up to 10 grams to make it simple, with 1 scoop providing an even 5 grams. Like the subjects in the recent sleep deprivation study, you may well be perfectly fine with a high dose of creatine in a single serve. That is something that you would need to experiment with. If for whatever reason I personally have a poor night's sleep and I have an important day of cognitive tasks, I would try and split that 30-gram dose over 2 to 3 doses, again with food. If I had a history of concussions, high stress, depression, or Alzheimer's, I would strongly consider doubling my typical daily dose to 20 grams per day. As I mentioned earlier, there's not convincing data here yet, but there's a signal to suggest that when our brain health is compromised, brain creatine levels can decline and various aspects of cognition can be improved with high-dose creatine supplementation. Importantly, 20 to 30 grams per day taken ongoing has been shown to be safe, except for people with pre-existing kidney disease. If you're healthy, you need not worry about your kidneys or liver. And no, you also do not need to worry about creatine causing hair loss. That is not an adverse effect that's well supported by evidence at all, despite what you may read online. So to summarize, for me, creatine supplementation looks something like this. 10 grams of creatine per day split across 2 5-gram servings, each with food to improve glycogen replenishment and decrease the chance of those gastrointestinal symptoms. To calculate this for yourself, use the 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight formula. 30 grams of creatine on days where I have inadequate sleep and need my brain running on all cylinders, days when I'm in meetings, recording podcasts, etc. And if you're worried about fractures, the dose used to improve bone geometry was 0.14 grams per kilogram per day. And if you're someone who has acute or chronic brain damage, concussion, Alzheimer's, etc., it's thought that at least 20 grams per day is required to significantly increase brain creatine levels. Although I must emphasize again that more research is needed here to understand how creatine affects cognition within these contexts. Now, perhaps you're thinking, is this amount of creatine something that we can get from food? Do we really need to supplement? To give you an idea, here's how much food I would need to eat to get 10 grams of creatine per day, my typical daily dose. Over 2 kilograms of red meat per day, over 2.5 kilograms of chicken breast per day, over 3 kilograms of codfish per day, over 2 kilograms of salmon per day, over 2 kilograms of pork per day, or, and get this, 400 cups of cow's milk per day. So yeah, it would take a lot of food to get 5 to 10 grams of creatine per day, and you would likely consume far more calories than would be otherwise healthy. Personally, I'm going to stick to 10 grams of Momentous creatine monohydrate. It is convenient, relatively inexpensive, and as I mentioned earlier, third-party tested for purity. There we go, 5 reasons to supplement with creatine, along with some specific recommendations on dose, type of creatine, and of course, my preferred brand, Momentous. If you found this episode informative, please hit subscribe and share it with your friends and family. And if you want more information on creatine, check out previous episodes of The Proof with Dr. Eric Rawson, which was episode 212, and Dr. Darren Kandau, episode 291. And with that, thank you very much for hanging out with me. I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye for now.